Hi, I'm Paul J, and welcome to theAnalysis-news. In a few seconds, we'll be back with an organizer from West Virginia. Please don't forget there's a donate button, the subscribe button, and the YouTube subscribes are very interesting. Even though we're doing thousands of views, our subscriber numbers never go up, which I believe is part of YouTube suppression of our channel. So if you're watching and you haven't subscribed on YouTube, you don't have to go to YouTube, but if you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and let's see if it actually will move. Because some other progressive sites have found channels on YouTube, there seems to be some monkey business going on with subscriber numbers. Anyway, be back in just a few seconds. As I've been promising, I'm going to be talking to organizers this year, people working at workplaces, schools, and communities fighting to make progressive change. For the last 3.5 years, organizers in West Virginia have been building a movement to urge ordinary people to run for political office and win. On their website, this is how they describe their work. West Virginia Can't Wait is a movement to win a people's government in the Mountain State. For too long, the wealthy good old boys club of both parties has rigged the system against us. We know our fight isn't left versus right, it's up versus down. 3 years in, we've recruited and trained 107 candidates who refuse to take corporate cash and who answer to the working people of our state. We're out to win a government where the people who work the hardest and bear the most are also the ones who write the laws. In 3 years' time, West Virginia Can't Wait has built the largest electoral organizing infrastructure our state has seen in decades. Again, I'm quoting from the website of West Virginia Can't Wait. With county teams in all but one of our 55 counties, 39 constituency groups representing seniors, veterans, and so on, and 107 candidates running under the West Virginia Can't Wait banner, our movement 3 years in is poised to take on the wealthy good old boys club and win. Good old boys. I guess we're talking about Joe's friends. Now joining us is Katie Lauer. She's the co-executive director of West Virginia Can't Wait. Thanks for joining us, Katie.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It's great to be here.
So before we get into what's going on in West Virginia, you're not originally from West Virginia, so how and why did you wind up in West Virginia?
Yeah, great question. I am from about an hour north of the West Virginia line. I grew up in the Pittsburgh area, and I found my way here almost 15 years ago now. I grew up in a family where service and community involvement was really valued, and so spent most of my weekends of my childhood attending one of my brother's Boy Scout meetings or helping in a community garden project or helping paint the house of a neighbor. My grandma was adamant that we shoveled all of the driveways in our neighborhood when we were growing up, that sort of thing. And when I got to college, I got to go to school, and I got to go to a little school in Ohio. I fell in with a handful of folks that were from Central Appalachia that taught me a lot about the fact that some of the things that I was doing sort of service work around when I was growing up weren't just sort of facts of the world. It wasn't just a fact of the world that some people just happened to be poor, or it wasn't just a fact of the world that some people didn't have enough money to keep up their houses. In fact, there was systemic failures. There was a thing going on behind the scenes that set up our society that way. And they especially taught me about the ways that was happening in places like West Virginia. And through those relationships and through the things I learned over those handful of years of my life, I ended up moving here initially to an itty bitty little town called Arnett in the Southern Coalfields, and got involved in fights over safe drinking water access and mountaintop removal, strip mining.
And so, but for like almost 11, 12 years before West Virginia Can't Wait, you were organizing in those areas. As a
Right.
paid staff person, were you working in organizing?
It was a real mix. So my first volunteer job was with a youth-led Appalachian organization called Mountain Justice. And from my volunteering with that group, I got my first paid organizer job working for an Appalachian coalition called the Alliance for Appalachia that was made up of 15 member groups all throughout the coal fields. Outside of West Virginia, too. That included Eastern Kentucky and Western Virginia and part of East Tennessee. And then I just stayed involved in that kind of environmental justice work for a number of years. And so that included things like doing flood response work. West Virginia, in part because of the logging and strip mining industries, and in part because of climate change, has fairly frequent 100-year floods. And it also meant helping to lead some of the organizing around things like the water crisis we had here in 2014, where 300,000 people lost safe drinking water access for a number of weeks. And so that community was a big part of how I was connected in the state, was through people that were doing work to make sure that all of us have a safe place to live.
So West Virginia Can't Wait is really targeted at getting people to run for office, helping them and winning based on a mostly common platform. And you're running in a state which has, at least for years until relatively recently, was run by the Democratic Party machine, and is still very strong. It's Joe Manchin's machine, essentially, keeps him in office. Although the state's now increasingly voting Republican, and the state went for, electorally, I believe, went for Trump in the last election, although during the Democratic primary, I think, what was it, every single district went for Bernie Sanders in the
That's
Democratic
right.
primary.
That's correct. Yeah.
So it's an interesting mix of politics there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'll say, maybe to share one more piece of my personal story, Paul, that I think is a common bridge and part of a unifying thread that we see through our work, is that one of the reasons I got involved in electoral work, which I'd been pretty hands-off about, since I had first moved to West Virginia, was that in the wake of the chemical spill, there were some very simple changes that the water company, West Virginia American Water, could have made, that could have been mandated by our Public Service Commission to make it such that a chemical spill like that would have never happened again. And we did all of the things that I know to do as an organizer. We ran, I think, what was a really effective issue-based campaign, and we lost. And the reason we lost is because the governor, our corporate governor, appointed corporate appointees to occupy the positions of that are on the Public Service Commission board. And I think it was sort of a last straw for me in realizing our government is so rigged, it is so much under corporate control, that even in this most extreme, acute situation that impacts a significant portion of our state, we're a tiny state. 300,000 people is a lot of folks for West Virginia. We have fewer than 2 million people here. Even then, under those very drastic circumstances, we couldn't even get the most basic protections. And so part of the foundation of West Virginia Can't Wait, and why you'll hear things on our website, for example, that say we're out to contest for power against the corporate leadership of both parties, is that in many ways for folks who have lived in the state, our lives are not that much different, whether there are corporate Democrats or corporate Republicans that are in power. A lot of the things that the day-to-day issues that we struggle with are sort of agnostic along party lines in that way, right? So a great example is that, a lot of people's lives got worse in the state under about 80 years of corporate Democratic Party power. And so that is a common and unifying experience. I think it's part of why we see a lot of popularity among sort of like outsider candidates, especially on the national level, like Bernie or Trump, that are seen as, they don't represent the status quo. And I think there's good reason for people to have that preference. The status quo hasn't served us very well.
So we'll talk more about the people that you're working with and organizing and coming forward to run. But what's the basic methodology of organizing? What's your plan?
Yeah, so there's a few things that we realized after the 2022, like the 2020 cycle, which was our first big entree into this world. One is that folks really, there was this incredible amount of energy and activity around our gubernatorial campaign. It was really the thing that we were able to build a lot of our other movement architecture in conjunction with. So running a gubernatorial campaign meant that we were not only sort of contesting for the highest office in the state and offering solutions that were the size of the problem our state's facing right now, but it also was a vehicle for us to organize people into other roles. So that was the year that we recruited and ran 107 candidates. It was the year that we built the constituency teams and the county teams. And so one thing we learned in that process is that telling the truth about what it's going to take to win governing power is a part of what gets people on board, right? To tell the truth about what it's going to take to win, what kind of risks we need people to take, what kind of roles we need people to occupy. The other thing I'll say we learned that year is that we just have an incredible amount of bench building to do. And we got a good start that year. We now, between our first cycle and this next sort of these odd off-cycle elections, we now have 20 people that are in office that are governing, that came through with West Virginia Can't Wait.
At what levels are they in office?
We have 4 folks that are in the state house right now, and the vast majority of those folks are our city councilors. We have a couple of school board members as well. And I think it's really trained our eye toward, even more so than I think we began with, toward doing that kind of bench building work that's going to add up over time. We're not, our corporate opponents have been accumulating power for decades collectively. And we think it's going to take that kind of collective generational effort to make a dent in our ability to contend with them.
In these places where you've elected these 20 candidates, have they been running against people who are in districts that would have been Democrat or Republican? Are you like,
yeah, it's
who are you beating?
Right. It's across the board. And it's also, I will say, across the board too, in the people who run with us. So the vast majority of our candidates are Democrats. We also have people that run as independents, as Republicans, and as Mountain Party folks. That's the equivalent of the Green Party in West Virginia, that all run on our ticket. And the way that we select them is they have to sign on to a pledge that is that sort of foundational no corporate cash pledge. There's some other things included in it, as well as onto our platform. And
well, what are the key points of the platform? Because if someone's coming from a Republican angle or a Democrat angle, I think I love the fact it doesn't get locked into the partisan parties. On the other hand, what's the policy that people are agreeing to run on?
Yeah, there's a wide range. So maybe I'll tell you a little bit about how we built our platform, Paul. So building the platform was a thing that came out of our gubernatorial campaign. And the way that we created it was through this program we ran called the Summer of 10,000 Conversations. And we organized our field teams to go out and to have and record 100 conversations with their team, 100 conversations each with their team, to log into this big sort of one-on-one conversation log. And our gubernatorial candidate and other staff were doing those conversations at the same time. And so the platform we wrote was built out of those conversations. And so in many ways, teachers in our state wrote our educators platform, educators part of our platform. Minors wrote this part of our platform called the Minors Bill of Rights. there are a number of things in the platform about land ownership, and so people that live adjacent to landholding companies helped write that part of the platform. So it was really this sort of ground up drafting process, which I will was pretty cumbersome, as you might imagine, if you can think about processing all that input. And then was ratified through a series of delegates meetings. And so one of the things that I think makes it possible for people from different party affiliations to sign on to it is that there is a legitimacy to the way that it got built with a lot of input from a lot of people. I think the other thing is that we also very purposely position our organization that way. So we have one of the things we teach new people that come onto our work is that we don't pick fights that are left versus right. We pick fights that are up versus down. And our interest is in having people that are in office that are not beholden to corporate interests. Most fundamentally, that's our fundamental belief about what's corrupt about our political system.
Not left versus right, up and down, but a lot of times up and down translates to left versus right.
I don't know, Paul. We might disagree about that. I mean, in our
take climate. You have a lot of on the Trump side, and I would say the majority of right-wing politicians and such. Not all, but are out. Certainly Trump circles, out and out climate deniers. I don't know whether that's up, down, left, right. I mean, there is a. If you look at what the solutions on climate are going to be, it involves government deregulating coal slowly and transitioning to sustainable energy. I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't some. How is that not also a left-right issue?
Sure, it's a good question. I think the history of this place is one example that matters, which is that as coal industry and coal executives were rising to power in West Virginia, the party that they did that under was the Democratic Party. In many ways, like Democrats were the people who were lining their pockets with the help of coal executives because they were doing favors for them. I think if we look at the party under which the most resource extraction and wealth extraction and under which most of the union busting happened in this state, it was under the Democratic Party's leadership.
Okay, I see where the disconnect is here. I know there are people that call the Democrats left. I mean, I don't.
Right. You're saying
maybe this is where the disconnect in the conversation is, because I never consider the corporate Democrats as being on the left, but I know a lot of people do. So.
And I will say, I think I think that might be that's a helpful distinction. And I think I respond that way because I think in the common vernacular of the way that people talk about left and right in politics and in our state is in a Democrat and Republican framework. And so maybe this is the part where I think we probably have alignment, Paul, which is like our sense is that our state got much worse under corporate Democratic leadership and continues to do so. And the needs of working West Virginians continue to get undermined. And that is in that way, we don't organizationally have allegiance to the Democratic Party. So that's the thing that we want to.
No, I get it. I mean, that I fully understand. I just, like I said, I'd never call them left, but whatever. Sure. We don't need to
we might have
argue about the semantics of that.
Yeah.
Okay, I was going to wait to talk about this, but I know everybody watching wants to talk about it, so we'll talk about it, and then we'll get on more about what the real work is. Obviously, what hell is going on with this Joe Manchin story? Even the miners' union, which has, if I understand it correctly, in the past has supported Manchin, came out and demanded Manchin actually support this Biden administration Build Back Better bill, and saying that there's some very concrete things that would help West Virginian miners if the bill was passed. It does not seem to have shaken Manchin's resolve at all. Give us a picture of what is that machine around Joe Manchin that makes him more or less, it seems, immune even to the miners' union?
Yes, I love this question, Paul, because I think the thing that you're underscoring is so important in terms of the way we think about how we relate to Manchin, which is like understanding what is the apparatus behind him and what is his history in the state. So I think a couple of important things to know about him are that he comes from a political family. He's had cousins and other relatives that have been involved in political machines before he came along. And he has slowly ascended over a career through the ranks of being a member of the House and then the Senate and then governor and then running for Senate, right? He's a politician by vocation. And in the process of that, he consolidated power around him. His examples of that are his cousin is the current director of the state party, or the head of the state party. He has shared campaign managers and other sort of key staffers with our current sitting governor, Jim Justice. And in many ways was the reason that Jim Justice was elected, because the Democratic machine got Jim Justice into office and sort of picked them as their guy. It's pretty hard to get elected for a higher office in the state. And in some cases for state level offices with, by that I mean state house or state senate offices, without the blessing of that machine. And Manchin has even gone so far to undermine the success of other Democrats when they don't step in line. So the clearest example of that is Charlotte Pritt is a progressive who ran against Joe Manchin for governor and successfully beat him in the primary. And then Manchin went on to raise funds from Democrats to undermine her so that the Republican opponent would win and so that he would continue to maintain power in the party. And so I think that story, and I think that just sort of like watching the ways in which Manchin has consolidated power over time, it's hard to see that he is serving any other entity besides his own interest, right? Like a lot of the maneuvers he makes are about a consolidation of power. And therefore he controls the party mechanisms that he needs to control in order to maintain his position. And because most folks are afraid of him and afraid of his influence, it's rare that people will challenge him upright. He's kind of he's sort of made himself into this excellent position of being able to remove challenges from below because he controls so much. And I think it's why he is seemingly impenetrable, is because I think that he actually is, that the party here won't challenge him. He doesn't get anything from appeasing the national party apparatus. He is in much more contact with his corporate donors than he is with any residents of the state.
Yeah, wasn't there a phone call transcript?
Yes, there's a transcript.
Tell us about what that phone call was, because
Sure.
Why wasn't that a scandal in West Virginia? That phone call essentially revealed who he works for.
Right. I think you're referencing his weekly call with Exxon executives that was recorded and leaked, that he has regularly.
What was it? Exxon and maybe some other donors too, I thought.
Yeah, I think that's right. I knew that Exxon was there. There may have been other donors as well that I think are in that community.
But if I remember correctly, one of the points in the conversation is one of the donors said to him, if you're good, don't ever compromise on the filibuster, like a very direct marching order on.
Sure. Right, exactly. And so I think it's really important for us to see it because, right, that's where Manchin is that's his team. That's who he's making choices alongside. And we have not amassed enough power to challenge his machine outright yet. And I think that was a little bit of a side comment, Paul, but I'll say is part of why West Virginia Can't Wait organizationally has really been tuning our focus to bench building and trying to build the bench and try to build the skills and power to be able to get ourselves in a position to challenge versus trying to influence him, because we know that Exxon phone call has more impact than a thing that we can do right now. So maybe to answer your outrage question, I think part of the answer is just like it's just old hat that this isn't an unfamiliar. I mean, for goodness sakes, our current governor is is himself a coal executive, right? That there's a put into office by Manchin. I think we have a long history here of party bosses and industry bosses being closely linked. So I don't think the Exxon news is news.
When the teachers went on strike in West Virginia, it was quite a militant strike, and if I understand correctly, had a lot of popular support.
That's quite right. Yeah. And I think maybe to talk more about this sort of cross-partisanness, I think one of the things that also made the strike really effective is that there were a few Democrats in the state house that were sympathetic to the teachers, but by and large, the majority of corporate Democrats and the majority of corporate Republicans did not support the teacher strike. And the organizers of that strike made a very conscious choice to not make the strike a partisan fight, but to make it an issue-based fight. And I think it's part of how they were able to gain ground is because they weren't asking educators to show their party affiliation at the door. They were inviting folks to say what are the things they needed to make their workplace better and then to go fight for them together. And I think there's some important lessons for us there and lessons we've taken in thinking about how to construct the work of our own organization about the ways in which teachers pulled that off. And they won real gains, especially around healthcare.
So let's go back to your process. So you held these conversations. What was it? The summer of how many conversations?
The summer of 10,000 conversations.
10,000 yeah. Conversations. So what is that conversation? What does that mean?
Yeah, so they start there. The question we would often ask during those conversation drives would start in an open-ended way. So we might ask people something like, what's the first thing you would do if you were governor? Or what's impacting you or someone you love? Or what's something you wish you could fix around here, right? So we ask questions that were open and that were close to people's experiences. And I think one of the most striking things that came out of those conversations and that has given me, I think, a spark of hope about the organizing potential in our place is that when we ask people what they want to see, for example, we might follow up with like, how does that play out in the education system? Or like, what's something you want to see for your kids' schools? That by and large, the answers we got were very common, that people had a lot of similar visions for what they want to see happen on the local level across party or across their party affiliation. So things like we want mental health professionals in our schools and to ensure that every school has one. We want smaller class sizes. We want fill in the blank. That those are very common themes. And I think it mattered that the conversations were steered toward what's close to home versus what do you think about national figure or national issue or something else that's sort of more remote and is about the things we often find we get divided on. And so those conversations, we logged them. There were a couple questions in the survey, in those conversations that were a little more survey based. So they might say, of these 15 issues, which of them are you most concerned about? And then again, all of that information got digested by our policy team to form the basis of a platform. And then where we had gaps, we would go and check in with those constituencies. So if we felt like, we don't have enough feedback from minors about the minors piece of this platform, we would go out and have some deliberate conversations with just minors to get their take. I'll say,
well, if you take that education issue, take the education question, mm-hmm. You want smaller class sizes. Well, yep. Smaller class sizes means more teachers. Mm-hmm. More teachers means more money. So then you get to the question of taxation. And if you want to have that, you've got to have more revenue, which raises the issue of shouldn't wealthy people in West Virginia pay more taxes?
Yes.
So right. Do you engage in that? Because that, whether you want to call it up, down, left, or right, if you're not going to tax the wealthy more, you ain't going to get more teachers. Right. Unless you want to tax working people more, and no one's going to.
That's exactly right. Yeah. In fact, one of the things that came out of one of the things that was important to us in the platform is that we had a way to pay for everything inside of the platform, that it was revenue neutral in the way that it was a cost neutral in the way that it was built. And so one of the things that it did include is a wealth tax that was also ratified as a part of the convention and that was fairly popular among the folks we talked to.
So not necessarily necessarily just higher income tax, but actually wealth tax.
A wealth tax explicitly. That's right.
Okay. I mean, just as a side note, that's interesting because there actually are some libertarian right types, if you want to go back to left, right, who actually are in favor of a wealth tax because they don't think this sort of inherited aristocracy is a good thing in terms of democracy and so on. So, and sometimes that even crosses lines.
One thing we would say to folks on the campaign trail that I think is it feels true to people. And then I think naming it as a truth also was like, yeah, that's right. Is that Jim Justice, our governor, our billionaire governor, who's the richest man in the state, pays a lower tax rate than someone who works at the cumulative tax rate than someone who works at the Dollar General. And the sort of, because of all the loopholes that he's subject to. And so I think that sort of, I think there's a feeling that the system is rigged, and I think that sort of information just sort of reinforces how rigged it is. I was going to say, Paul, just maybe to talk about one more rigged thing, is that that part of the conversations where we ask people, what's the most, like, of this collection of issues, what are you most fired up about? Corruption 5 times more than any other issue was the thing that folks raised as a concern. That there's and people would use different language for it, like crooked, like the lobbyists are crooked, or we need to ban the lobbyist, or it's money in politics, or it's the wealthy good old boys club, or it's the elite, whatever name it was, that were manipulating the way government works in order to serve themselves.
I mean, that's interesting because that isn't technically, well, it isn't technically corruption. In theory, corruption is like illegal. It's essentially calling the actual structure of the system is corrupt.
Yes, right. I think both, and I would say I think both things were said in different ways, right? So I think there was a sense that there's something just sort of morally corrupt about lobbyists getting kickbacks, right? For the way in which they're able to move their own agenda, right? There's sort of this like sense of, there's just something that feels wrong about that, even if it's legal. And then I think the actual corruption of, for example, to talk about our governor one more time, he has a record of not paying his employees and is delinquent on millions of dollars worth of taxes. And I think there's also just sort of there's plenty of straight up corruption too that happens that I think folks are fired up about.
All right. So I interviewed Jane McAlevey, but she defines the difference between advocacy, mobilizing, and organizing is that when you're mobilizing, you're more or less getting people that agree with you to go do something. Real organizing is talking to people who don't agree with you, which I'm guessing you're doing a lot of. So explain to me, people who understand that the system is rigged and that politics is corrupt and so on and so on. And this isn't just in West Virginia, but how the hell are they voting for Trump? And even more so, I can even almost understand Trump more. Then why are they voting for the Republican Party? At least Trump pretends to be sort of an outlier in all this. But how do you understand how people get their heads around this, even if they hate corporate Democrats?
I think that maybe the first thing I'll say is I'm so grateful for Jane's framework. I'm actually there's a piece that I wrote that should be out in the Forge in the next couple of weeks. It's about Manchin and the difference between organizing and mobilization. And I think one of our the mistakes that we often make in doing our work as change makers is we lean too much on mobilization and put ourselves in the posture of not having enough power to make mobilization actually effective. And so I'll just I want to say yes to Jane's frameworks, and I think they're very helpful for us thinking about and making a distinction between the kind of work that a moment might call for. For us, organizing is sort of the bread and butter of what we do, and why we think is the thing we're primarily oriented around. It's rare that we will have a mobilization moment in our work, and so I think, yes, to say that, like, that sometimes means often means we're talking to people that we're not in perfect alignment with. I think one complication that I want to offer is that I think sometimes political scientists or political pundits that, will write for The Hill or whatever, I see these kind of arguments made a lot in the New York Times, is like that they think of people's politics as being fully formed in a particular ideology or in a particular that people are Republican in a way that is like sort of embedded in them, that has a through line that is always consistent with the way that they act in the world, or that people are Democrats in a way that's always consistent with the way they act in the world. And I think that it's a mistake for us as organizers I think that kind of thinking and that rhetoric we hear a lot is something that's important for us as organizers to reject, and to actually see people as being much more complicated when we're in a relationship with them. So an example of this from the campaign trail is that there was a woman who hosted that we met on the campaign trail because she was a small business owner in town, and someone had a relationship, and we were going to meet with everybody, and got introduced to her, who had a Trump sign outside of her bed and breakfast that she owned in this rural county. And we went and met with her, and we talked to her about things we're building the platform, and asked her what she wanted to see for the state. And she was really concerned about the education system. She was concerned about the ways in which the money that comes from resource extraction in the state gets swallowed up and spit out, and who's benefiting from that. And we talked to her, our candidate talked to her for the afternoon, and she decided to vote for our slate and work with us and be a part of the effort we're up to. I don't think that's because she had an ideology and then the ideology became this thing. I think it's because she's complicated, because we're all complicated. We all make choices all the time that are discongruous with a particular through line of thinking. And I think that if we want to get more folks that are with us, we have to approach them from that complication and invite them into our work from the point that they can connect. It's not exactly an answer to your question, Paul, about what are the trends we're seeing, which I'll just honestly say, I think I have a little harder time because of that complication, feels complicated to answer. But I think a thing I'll say in the spirit of maybe this being us having this conversation and other organizers watching is that I really think if we're going to be effective organizers in the moment that we're in, we've got to believe that more people than we might see on paper could be with us, and to go toward them and find out. And we're not going to get everyone. I don't mean to suggest that we have people that are in our network that voted for Trump, and people that voted for Manchin, and people that voted for Bernie. I mean, there's a range. And I think that our job as organizers isn't to get people into some perfect level of alignment. I think it's to call a direction and invite a lot of people to come to that direction. And I'll say, like, just to say a little bit more about Trump, I think it's part of why he's an effective figure, is because there's not a pure ideology he's rooting for. He's creating an umbrella that lots of people can find themselves in and be drawn toward it. And I think our job is not to get people into ideological precision. It's to create our own umbrella and draw people into it that might be discongruous, and also, thank God, like, then we'll have more power. So I that's sort of how I think about like what the project is in front of us.
Jane talks about, when I asked her a similar question, when you're organizing at a workplace, whether it's a hospital in Vegas where she did a lot of work, or other places, how do you deal with this fact that you're trying to build unity amongst the workers, but in fact, the working class is quite divided when it comes to politics? And she says, well, they would focus on the contract and the struggle over the
Yes,
contract
right.
and building unity around that. And then she says, in the course of that, one, of course, you're talking about all kinds of stuff, but two, workers would start to understand, well, it's the people that own this place that are the real problem. And then you start to make the connection between people who own stuff and people who don't own stuff. So there's sort of a combination. Now this is me, I think, drawing a conclusion, but there's a combination between issue-oriented organizing and building fronts around issues, and then longer-term kind of strategic organizing, where there are some objectives that people aren't going to agree to, but if we don't do them, we're screwed. And let me get to that. Let me get to that one because it's kind of obvious, especially in West Virginia.
Right. Alignment can't be prefigurative. Like it's not like alignment happens and then we can work on a campaign together. It's that we say, so an example of this in our own work right now is we're working on a city council race in the city of Charleston here. And we have a campaign established. We're recruiting candidates. We built a platform in that place for candidates to run on. And we are having the difficult conversations about alignment and vision and where we're headed in the process of building out that campaign with the intention that we can win some governing power. Hopefully we'll get some folks into office. And by having our sort of contract equivalent, the campaign goals that we're setting out, it becomes the umbrella. It's the place where people can get under the same tent and have the tricky relationship, like hold the trickiness of the relationship where we can find more commonality and find a more common opponent. And so I think that parallel is a correct one, that like alignment is a product of the work. It's not something we can prefigure.
Now, I said before that Bernie did really well in West Virginia in the Democratic primary with a message attacking the oligarchy, the rich, taxing the wealthy, and so on. And he wins every single district in West Virginia in a party where the Democratic Party is controlled by the machine, and the machine meant Hillary Clinton. So this kind of language, it's not like it was alienating people. Quite the contrary, Sanders was winning. And I know when I've talked to people that are even pro-Trump voters, and you talk against the oligarchy and or use language similar, they're actually on board with that. Somehow they think Trump's on board with that. And then the other issue, which I found talking to people who either are pro-Trump, is that on climate, to my surprise, when they'll say, "Oh, I agree with Trump on this, this, and that," I said, "Well, what about the climate denial?" And they say, "Oh no, I don't agree with that." Like people are getting the real danger of the climate crisis, and it seems to me that is, and even if I don't know if people are telling you this or not, but isn't that the real overriding issue in West Virginia, given that the economy is so much based on coal?
Maybe to speak to your first points, I think those things are true. That I think one other way that the idea of corruption gets expressed is that there's this like club of people that are controlling everything. And the language we use in West Virginia is the good old boys club, or the wealthy good old boys club. It's this sort of like cabal of people that truly do sort of run the show and make appointments and figure out how to enrich themselves because of it, both in terms of their position and in terms of actual wealth. And that there is cross-party, cross-ideological frustration about that. I'll also say I have talked to a lot of West Virginians, especially in the last several years, and I don't think I've ever met a person who is sort of what is a climate denier, as I think folks might think of it as. Maybe I think I probably have met people that have like maybe it'll be okay or it won't be as bad as people say it's going to be sort of thing. But I don't know that I've ever talked to someone, even coal miners, who have said, this is a thing that's not happening. Surely those people exist. And I don't think that it's a broadly felt idea. And so I think those are points of unification. I don't know that I think it's tricky to say that any one issue is sort of the issue. For example, like I think someone could just as easily say the opioid crisis is that issue for our state, that it's the reason that we have 7,000 children in the foster care system, which again, for our state, our size is huge. It's the reason our school infrastructure is crumbling because teachers have to act as therapists. It's the reason that people's homes' lives are being degraded, why small businesses can't hire people. I think part of what's challenging in our state in many places is that some of these issues are so interconnected that it's hard to say that's the thing. I think similarly, you could say, well, the coal industry is responsible for the opioid crisis because part of how people started taking pills in the first place is because doctors that were connected to the coal industry.
People should watch that TV series Dope Sick, which is about exactly this. A young woman who works in the coal mines starts taking OxyContin because of an injury. In fact, it was Daniel Ellsberg phoned me because I'm doing this film with him. You got to watch Dope Sick because that's what it was like for the nuclear war business. It's the same thing. They knew how destructive this could be, but for money, they're doing it anyway. I mean, certainly all these things wind up being much the same question.
Right. So I think in that sense, and I'll say is maybe one more reason that we felt it was important to put together a comprehensive platform for the state is because so many things are interlocking that we've got to think about some of the problems we're facing in an interconnected way. To us, the through line is that there are a small handful of people that are benefiting off of this setup, and a vast majority of us who are getting screwed by it. And that's, I'll say, like one of the unifying forces that we unite our teams around, and I think unite our work around. So I think that's how we approach the bigger puzzle.
So when you knock on doors, I assume that's a lot of the work is knocking on doors, right?
There's a bunch of knocking on doors. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a thing.
And people come and you start, whether it's, well, even take the opioid crisis. So what are your candidates proposing as a solution to the opioid crisis?
Yeah, I'll offer the example in Charleston because it's the freshest thing we're working on that I think goes after this. So Charleston, West Virginia is not only one of the sort of centers of the opioid epidemic, it's also says the CDC is currently staring down the most significant HIV outbreak in the country, which are related things, along with other sort of tangential health crisis issues. And so there's a lot of things that are compounding that are around the impacts of these big pharmaceutical companies wreaking havoc in the state. There has been a local organization called SOAR that's been doing harm reduction work in the city for a number of years. And we're doing things like making sure people had safe implements and instruments to use drugs, and making sure that people had access to things like HIV screening and sort of other sort of basic medical care. And all of the things that they were promoting and doing were all in accordance with CDC guidelines that would sort of lessen the impacts of the crisis. Their work recently got outlawed by our Democratic-run city council and mayor. And so, as you might imagine, the crisis has been getting worse ever since that harm reduction effort got forced to stop. And so part of what we're advocating for inside of the Charleston Can't Wait platform are decriminalizing those harm reduction measures and going a little further. So there's also measures in the platform to open a safe injection site, to have a 24-hour trauma resource center, and to make basic services like syringe services and syringe drop boxes a thing that is a community service that helps people that are use more safely. So those are the kinds of things that are in the measure, and I think that knocking on doors and talking to folks, including talking to folks who, some of the parts of our campaign included writing letters to folks that are in jail, and also reaching out, door knocking or tent knocking in places where folks are housing insecure or are houseless. And what we found is the closer that folks are to those problems, the more creative and bold solutions and ideas that folks had for them. And so that's what made it into our platform.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks so much, Paul. It's good to be here.
And thank you for joining us on theAnalysis.news. And don't forget, there's a donate button. If you're on YouTube, please hit subscribe. And I don't know if we have to sue YouTube to do something about this, but let's see what happens. And most importantly, get on the email list. If you are watching on YouTube, they've already taken down some of our videos. It was only because Matt Taibbi wrote an article about it that they put them back up again. We never know what's going to happen on YouTube, but if you're on our email list, you'll know what's happening. And the best place to watch actually is at the website, theanalysis.news. Thanks again.